So we know that GDP is a measure of the market price of final goods and services produced within an economy over a period of time. And we know that GDP helps us vaguely define or help us vaguely measure our material living standards. But there are many limitations to GDP, as there are many limitations to any statistical figure. Um, in this lecture, we'll look at what the limitations to GDP as a measure of living standards actually are. So let's look at this systematically, and let's go through the limitations step by step. So we have the first limitation is that non-market production is excluded. And this often includes, say, cash transactions or the black market. And although this actually adds to our material living standards, or may in fact intrude on our non-material living standards, they are not calculated by the GDP because they are so hard to measure. So examples include illegal production, such as any production in the black market, so illegal production, so DIY, so do-it-yourself housework, so mowing your lawn, etc. Home repairs, gardening, housekeeping, volunteer work are all included in this non-market production. And so, for example, say mowing your lawn, it may cost $50 to hire an assistant or to hire a professional lawn mowing service to mow your lawn, but it costs $0 and therefore not included in GDP. But you still derive around $50 worth of pleasure or material satisfaction from mowing your own lawn. And so that's why GDP is limited to the extent that it does not include non-market production. And therefore we can often say that GDP is understated because of this fact, because non-market production is excluded. Secondly, we have imputed production involves error. And what imputed production means is that some production that needs to be added to GDP are often estimated or imputed because it is not actually marketed or sold. So take for example rental prices. You're living in your own home, and that house or that dwelling provides a service to you, but however you're not actually paying rent because it is your own home. And so housing owners, we have to impute the actual rental price of a certain house based on, say, estimations of the area, the location, how well the house is, how big the house is, and the overall satisfaction you obtain from living in your house. So this involves a lot of error because it is only an estimation. So a lot of guesstimating from economists as to the actual rental price of an owned dwelling. So you can't make for certain the actual price you would have rented your house for should it not have been owned by you. And also we include other things such as government subsidies or provider services to the community. And it is often very hard to measure these government services that are subsidized or provided free of charge to the community, and therefore they are often imputed. The value of these production or these services are often imputed and included in the calculations of GDP. So here is another reliability error. Thirdly, we have quality changes are disregarded. What this means is that even though our GDP may be rising, or even though our inflation rate may be rising, and therefore since GDP or real GDP takes into account the change in inflation, we're not actually regarding any quality changes. So let's say a computer, or say Apple designed this iPhone. And as we know, iPhone costs a lot of money. They cost around $800. And the original Nokia phone only costs around $500. Even though we can see that the price of the phone has actually increased nearly 60% from $500 to $800, this would actually be discounted for by GDP, because the GDP figure is assuming that inflation has occurred and therefore GDP has gone down relative to the actual GDP. So real GDP in this case would have gone down or discounted for relative to actual GDP as measured by the ABS. But how we can see that we're deriving a lot more pleasure from the iPhone than we were from the Nokia, because we play games such as Angry Birds or Candy Crush on the iPhone, and it's a lot easier to use. But we're not accounting for the quality changes from a Nokia to an iPhone. And even though the iPhone is more expensive, the extra expense is worth it. So that's why quality change is disregarded, and therefore GDP cannot be a perfect measure to our living standards. Fourthly, we have calculating and using the chain price index involves error. So the chain price index involves possible error. So we know that GDP at market price needs to be statistically adjusted to remove exaggerations to the market value of national production caused by inflation, right? Or if we underestimate GDP due to deflation. So this process of converting GDP back to its real state, or from current prices to actual prices, we use what is called the chain price index. But however, it is very difficult to calculate such indices so that they accurately or fully reflect changes in the price of all goods and services entering the economy. So again, we're not considering quality changes or new market goods. And these are all the different possible limitations to calculating the CPI, which are then fed into the calculation of GDP. So any consumer price index limitations are actually fed into the calculation of GDP, because we use the CPI to actually adjust the GDP to obtain the actual or the real GDP in the economy. The fifth limitation is that the distribution of income is not included, is not explicated or shown. Even though GDP may rise, say, from $1 billion to $2 billion, this doesn't actually suggest that the entire economy has increased their material living standards. It may be just because one billionaire may have moved into this economy and transferred all his funds to this economy, and therefore the billionaire has contributed to all the increase in GDP. So it doesn't actually say that the overall living standards of the economy or well-being have increased. So the distribution of income is not taken into account. So a way to counteract this is we look at the real GDP per capita. And again, this is an imperfect measure, because although real GDP per capita may tell us the average income for everybody in the population, it doesn't tell us how the income is distributed relative to, like, say, different socioeconomic backgrounds. Okay, so that's the fifth limitation. Let me just rub out number 1 and number 2. So we'll just rub out this bit here. Need a little bit more space so we can move on to number 6 and then number 7. Okay. So we're keeping these. So we know that 1, non-market production excluded. 2, imputed production involves error. 3, quality changes are disregarded. 4, chain price index involves possible error. And 5, distribution of income is not explicated or shown. So another possible use of GDP is for international comparisons. So international comparisons. So we're trying to compare whether our nation is better off or worse off relative to other nations. But this may in fact be unreliable. So what this means is that how are we going to compare our GDP to US GDP? Because US GDP is measured in US dollars. So we have USD and AUD. We can't compare these two GDPs because they're in different currencies. So what we do is that appropriately we would use the current market exchange rate to convert the Australian dollar in terms of US dollars, or convert the US dollars in terms of Australian dollars to have an accurate comparison. But what this doesn't take account is the actual purchasing power of both economies. And so even though, say, US GDP is lower, say at $1 million, well obviously this is an untrue figure because US GDP is around a few $trillion, and Australia is also around, say, 1 million. Assumedly, we're going to say that the GDP is the same, and therefore the material living standards of both countries is the same. But we don't take into account, say, in the US, bread costs $1 a loaf. But in Australia, bread costs $2 a loaf. And therefore, we can purchase more using our $1 million in the USA than we can in Australia. So therefore, the material living standards in the USA are actually better off in terms of what they can buy relative to Australia, because even though we have the same GDP figure, the purchasing power of that same money or of the same income in the USA is greater than Australia. So what we do use is what is called the purchasing power parity exchange rate, so the PPP exchange rate, or a more accurate measure of GDP and for purposes of international comparison. And we'll talk about this concept later in the purchasing power parity exchange rate lecture. But for now, we're just going to assume that international comparison of GDP may be unreliable. So if you want to know more about the purchasing power exchange rate, go to the purchasing power exchange rate lecture, and I will talk about that in further detail. And last but not least, we have what is called our non-material living standards. So what GDP doesn't take into account is that GDP only measures our material living standards, but it doesn't actually measure our non-material living standards. So even though we may be producing a lot of goods and services, this may actually take away our time for leisure or our time with the family. And if our productions increase, therefore this may mean that we have less time for ourselves and even greater pollution rates. So there's often, as we know, a trade-off between living standards, material living standards, and non-material living standards. So in many cases, even though increasing GDP, if they are unsustainable, and then our non-material living standards can be compromised. And so here are the 7 major limitations to GDP as a measure of living standards. 1. Non-market production is excluded. 2. Imputed production involves error. 3. Quality changes are disregarded. 4. The chain price index involves possible error. 5. The distribution of income is not shown by GDP. 6. International comparisons of GDP may be unreliable. And last, 7. Non-material living standards are not measured by GDP.